Hello, everyone, and welcome back to FinTech Minutes Take with Finstep Asia. Today, we have a very special guest whom we're going to be talking to about transparency and why that's required. At the back of the FinCEN files, it's another highlight about why financial services need more transparency. Our special guest today is Mr. Andy Agathangelou. I didn't get the pronunciation right, I know, and I'm going to work on that, Andy. He's the founder of the Transparency Task Force, headquartered in London with offices across and presence across the world. So welcome, Andy. Welcome for
Hello.
joining FinStep Asia and FinTech Minutes Take. Andy, how about we go into you talking a little bit about yourself and your background in financial services over the last few years?
Thank you, Musheer. I think the first point I should make is that I didn't intend to ever become the leader of an international campaign organization. Up until 5 years ago, I was busy running my own consulting business quite successfully within the financial services sector. I've been in or connected to financial services since way back in 1986. But 5 and a bit years ago, in fact, I remember the date, Musheer, on the 6th of May 2015, I
Okay.
gave a speech at Senate's House, London University, about the need for radical reform of the financial services sector. And I found myself so impassioned by this need for reform of the finance industry that I decided thereafter to spend a bit of time on a voluntary basis doing something about the problem being the way the finance industry behaves and why it keeps finding reasons to give people reasons to distrust it. And what basically happened, Musheer, is that bit by bit, I found myself falling in love with the idea of becoming a campaigner for change in financial services because I believe the finance industry is profoundly important to society, but it desperately needs to change. And I'm very happy to dedicate the rest of my career on a voluntary basis trying to help make the change happen.
Well, it's coming up to Mahatma Gandhi's 150th anniversary, and one of his most famous quote is, "Be the change you want to see in the world." And it's lovely to see your dedication in terms of driving this with your love becoming a big passion now, right? That's where we are, and it's something that's quite deeply needed. So, how did this grow into this global organization with thousands of participants globally, right? From financial services and otherwise, in a very short span of time.
Well, basically, I think the key reason for our success and our fast growth is that the basic idea is very, very popular. There are many, many people within the financial services industry who have what I describe as a stand up rather than stand by mindset. In other words, they, like me, want to be part of the change. So I was encouraged to run an event. I ran an event in London, 7th of October 2015. Again, I remember that date as well. The
Almost
event
five
was
years to the day here.
the event was very successful. And afterwards, people came up to me, Musheer, and basically told me that they got it. They wanted to be part of a community, even a movement to help the change happen. So they volunteered. So I thought, I know what I'm going to do. I'm going to do that again. So I ran another meeting and then another one and then another one. And now dozens and dozens, maybe even hundreds of meetings later, we have approaching 3,000 people around the world who connect with the idea of a transparency task force encouraging reform of the financial services sector.
And why does this need the industry? And why aren't this something that's led by policymakers and regulators? I mean, this is prudential as it gets, right? This is what the regulators are supposed to instill, and with all the checks and balances, especially after 2008 and 2009, where the scrutiny significantly increased, at least on the risk side, we would expect that there's be higher transparency. So would you be able to give maybe a few examples of when we're talking about transparency, what are the things that we're talking about, and why that is important, not just for people in financial services, but the general public at large?
Of course, I think you touched on a very interesting point, which is why do we need to be doing this when we have regulators around the world? And the harsh reality is, Musheer, that regulators can only do so much. Um, the problem is this. regulatory intervention is all about external control. It's all about the regulators telling the industry how it must behave. Now, the financial services sector is so predisposed to finding profit that it will find ways to get to that profit, even if that means having to think of clever ways to get around the rules. And without a doubt, there are parts of the industry that do not really authentically embrace the spirit of the regulation. They all try to actively find legal, technically compliant ways around the rules. So what we say is that regulation on its own is simply not enough. What we really need is for the financial services industry around the world to embrace its true purpose, which is to serve society. And that's all about a very, very different culture. That's about putting principles before profit. It's all about putting the client truly first. So what we're all about is encouraging what we describe as a cultural transfusion to make this change happen. And I'll give you one very quick example here. One of the most obvious areas where transparency is needed is in relation to the costs and charges on investments. Now, there are some organizations that operate in a very, very transparent way where it's easy to understand what the client is really paying in costs and charges. Unfortunately, there are many others that aren't like that. And particularly on long-term investments, if you are paying more in cost than you think you are, over the long term, because of the compounding effect of those charges, it could actually corrode into the pension fund or the accumulated wealth that you have built up. So in general, simplistic terms, transparency leads to truthfulness, and that in turn leads to trustworthiness. And that is what we want to happen. We want the financial services sector around the world to behave in a manner whereby it deserves to be trusted.
So I'm going to play devil's advocate here, right? And not challenging the notion. I completely agree on the need for transparency. But some in financial services may say, hey, what we are doing is legal, right? As you mentioned, a lot of these, what they are allowed to do is legal. I mean, a lot of people have always spoken about charges that banks have for payments that can be quite significant for international payments, etc., and not quite as transparent as people believe. But they're like, this is all legal, and it's our fiduciary duty to make profits for our shareholders, right? At the end of it, they're not government institutions. Having said that, there are many, international banks or even local banks who are government owned or state owned, but largely quite a few of them are private banks. So they may have this argument that they have a fiduciary duty of generating profits for their shareholders, and they are operating legally. So why the change?
Okay, what an interesting matter you bring up. There is a huge misconception that the best way to run a business is to focus on maximizing profit in the short term. All the evidence actually shows that's the wrong way to do it, because if all you're ever doing is focusing on maximizing profit in the short term, you will never really build the organization in a manner to capitalize on the medium and long-term opportunities that are out there. Let's just take banks as an example. You would be amazed at how much reputational damage and financial burden the banks give themselves as a consequence of malpractice, malfeasance, misconduct, mis-selling. In various parts of the world right now, particularly the UK, Australia, the USA, the banks' reputations, generally speaking, not in all cases, but generally speaking, are being tarnished, even trashed, as a consequence of the sorts of things that they've been doing over the years in the hunt for short-term profit. It is never wise to allow your long-term decision-making be dictated by your short-term impulses. That is the fundamental flaw that the financial services sector keeps exposing itself to.
Great. Now and I think that's a very good way of putting things, right? It's sometimes people look at a too narrow focus on short-term profits, but longer term they're eroding their brand and trust, and everybody going to withdraw. Wells Fargo was one of those cases that happened in the U.S. a few years ago, and now we have the FinCEN files, right? Creating ripples across banking with class action suits against some of the world's largest banks in the pipes. But largely, for the layman or the person listening in, I guess the question will be that a lot of the argument is that, hey, these are self audited reports, and these are self assessment reports that are being reported by the banks to the regulators. This is not them trying to hide things. But what have we learned from a transparency perspective from FinCEN? Albeit that some of these are quite dated, 5 to 7 years old. Do you think that's still something that is existing in operation? Or do you think we have improved significantly since a majority of the cases reported in FinCEN in terms of the time?
Well, again, this is such an interesting topic and also so timely. In fact, I'll go off on a slight tangent, but I promise I will come back to your point.
Yeah.
On Monday, yesterday, I sent an open letter to our Prime Minister, Boris Johnson, as a direct consequence of a meeting we had with him on Friday of last week. And one of the paragraphs in the letter, which was mostly about pension scams, which unfortunately is a particularly big problem in the UK, but one of the paragraphs in the letter I sent Mr. Johnson was about the desperate need for the UK to re-establish itself as a beacon of integrity within the financial services sector. And I say that because we desperately need to do this. The UK's financial services sector is a very important part of our economic framework, but we have allowed ourselves, I say we, the banks in the UK have allowed themselves to get the reputation as becoming something of a money laundering capital around the world. And the FinCEN files show this. There is no doubt about it at all. There have been detailed write-ups, even documentaries about what has been going on. Now, it would be possible to be very, very naive and very wishful thinking and think, you know what, this is all just a matter of the past. But unfortunately, I do not believe that is the case. I think the banking sector around the world has allowed itself to become riddled with short-termism, profit maximization, frankly, fraud and corruption as well in places. There's no doubt about that. And as a consequence, the FinCEN files are in effect a huge dose of transparency that is desperately needed. But you know what, Musheer, this isn't the first time. Just a few years ago, we had the Panama Papers. What's going to be next? There needs to be a fundamental shake-up of the way the financial services sector sees itself, the way it's managed, the way it's regulated, the way it's governed, because it's too easy to start worrying that it's getting out of control.
Fair comment. Now, we had the transparency book come out
Yes, yes.
very recently, right? Which you have spearheaded, and I'm using the term spearheaded because of our the cover page of the book.
Yes.
Would you like to talk a little bit about?
I would love to. Not only would I like to talk about, I'd love to show you. So here's our book. Yeah, here's the book, and as you may be able to see, the title is "Why We Must Rebuild Trustworthiness and Confidence in Financial Services," and how we can do it. And the last part of that title, the bit about and how we can do it, is actually the key, because what we did last year, Musheer, is we went around the world. I personally ran meetings in Dublin, Amsterdam, Zurich, Brussels, Hong Kong, Singapore, Melbourne, Sydney, Washington, D.C., Boston, and New York to gather together the world's greatest minds to talk about this problem, the need for greater trust in financial services and what we can do about it. And we've managed to bring all that wonderful thinking, all that tremendous thought leadership together into one book. We have over 65 contributing authors, over 220 great ideas about how the system needs to be changed. And if anybody wants to know more, they just need to contact us through transparencytaskforce.org, and we'll make it very, very easy for them to acquire the book.
So, I mean, I was honored to be I think the only person from Asia in the book. Hopefully it changes in the next year's edition. And I was speaking about how, technologies like blockchain, etc., can be very useful for transparency, right? I'm very amazed that the blockchain evangelists are not talking about how that could be used for the US election, where mail fraud has come up quite significantly. And I'm like, here you go. There's a solution there. Not that I'm looking to be a blockchain evangelist, but I think there is certain cases where for authenticity and other cases, you can use the technology for transparency, right? That's one of the key elements embedded in distributed ledger technology and blockchain, as it were. Now, my question on this, and it's probably one to close with to get from you, is we're seeing this huge transition from traditional financial services, the brick and mortar, to the fintech world and the tech fins, right? The Alibabas of the world, the Tencents of the world, to the Amazons and Facebooks and Googles, all of them getting into financial services in a big way, either as banks themselves or providing services through other partners, right? Now, technology is meant to be a lot more transparent. You've seen quite a few fintech players who say they're very transparent and they showcase all the costs, etc., quite clearly. But my question to you is: do you believe that now, with more technology at play and more engagement of these technology players in financial services, we will have a lot more transparency, as it were, in the industry? Do you believe that, and do you feel that they are probably in a better place, despite their own issues on the other side of data transparency, right? About how they're using your data, which where the banks are not necessarily using your data for other things, it's more on the charges and fees and misconduct. While here, in a lot of cases, we're talking about how your data can be used in a non-transparent manner. So, any thoughts on the technologies world's significant influence on financial services and what they need to keep in mind to improve transparency?
For sure. I generally see technology as a tremendous ally of transparency for reasons like blockchain, not just blockchain, but for
Yeah.
reasons like blockchain. It is very clear that transparency and technology are good partners. The way I see it is this: it's really all about innovation, it's about entrepreneurism, it's about seeing new opportunities in the market, it's about new entrants coming in and starting to challenge the status quo, to disrupt the sector. There are still so many parts of the world's financial ecosystem that is frankly built on 20th century technology, quite literally 20th century technology, heavy, slow, cumbersome, um, legacy systems that are inefficient and expensive to operate. And the only reason why they haven't been replaced en masse by new kids on the block, so to speak, is because the organizations that own them and run them have huge market share, massive brand identity, etc. To my mind, what we want to see in the future is a vastly more competitive, fast moving marketplace where the cream rises to the top, where there's a true hierarchical structure based upon competence, value for money, service, etc. Not just the fact that some organization has a massive market share because it's always had a massive market share. So I welcome technology. It is to be encouraged. All the entrepreneurs out there, all the fintech startups out there, carry on doing your stuff, challenge the status quo, and bravely blast this sector to where it needs to go, which is the land of transparency, truthfulness, and trustworthiness. Thank you.
The three T's, right? Thank you so much, Andy. It's been a pleasure getting to know about the TTF and participating from here in Hong Kong. And I mean, this conversation is very, very timely, as well as very, very enriching in terms of the understanding of how transparency is important for financial services. And in some senses, I guess it has to be ingrained for the fintechs and the technology players and everyone that it is in their best interest and their fiduciary duty to ensure that there's maximum transparency, and that's the best way to go forward when you're offering services across the board. So thank you once again, and we look forward to staying in touch and working together more on this. Thank you.
Thank you, Musheer. I've really enjoyed the conversation. Thank you very much.
Thank you.